On June 1st, 2017, President Donald Trump announced that the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. He reasoned that the agreement, although important, hindered the economic growth of the US much more significantly than those of other signatories. This puts the US alongside Syria and Nicaragua as the only nations not signed up to the accord. So, what is the Paris Agreement? And does Trump have valid reasons to leave it? The Paris Agreement was negotiated by 195 countries at the 21st Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC. Thus, it is commonly known as the COP21 deal. It was adopted by consensus at the end of 2015, and all members promised to reduce their carbon output as soon as possible. Historically, most global climate policies have failed. US famously avoided the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and conflicts between the EU, China, and India caused the 2009 Copenhagen Agreement to end in disappointment. So, when the 2015 Paris Agreement achieved consensus adoption by all 195 member countries and the European Union, President Obama called it a historic day in the fight to protect our planet for future generations. The agreement employed a different strategy as follows. First, the Council chooses a target goal that all countries agree to be omnipotent. That goal here is to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Then, each country creates their own climate improvement plan, whether it is limiting carbon emissions, fighting deforestation, or any other suitable actions. These are formally called Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, or ICDCs. The key difference from previous agreements is that ICDCs are not legally binding, meaning although countries showcase their plans to the Council, they will not be penalized for breaking their promises. Rather, ICDCs serve as general guidelines and mobilize the whole world to combat climate change immediately. Every 5 years after, countries gather and reevaluate their contributions and adjust any unrealistic goals. Without the COP21 deal, the Earth's temperature will rise to 3.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level by 2100. With it, however, it will still reach 2.9 degrees above. Thus, efforts will be increased whenever possible. That seems like a good idea, right? Then why did Trump decide to withdraw from the Paris Agreement? Let's look at his top 4 bad reasons. First, he claims that it damages the US economy. The US has planned to cut its emissions by 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2025, and current levels are already halfway to this goal. If the second half of the goal is too ambitious, the US can change its policies freely as the Paris Agreement is non-binding. Similar arguments can be made towards Trump's claim that America's abundant energy reserves will be restricted, as how the US uses its energy is entirely up to itself. These arguments are perhaps also short-sighted, as fossil fuels have an inevitable deadline that is fast approaching. The world is moving towards greener energy, and multiple trillions of dollars are being invested in cleaner tech innovations. An American invented the solar cell in 1941, and the US had always been a global leader in sustainable energy. Trump's move will not only give up the nation's lead towards a zero-emission era, but also damage its blooming and highly profitable green industry. This leads to the second reason, and it is that it costs America jobs. Trump suggested that the Paris Accord can cost America as much as 2.7 million lost jobs by 2025, according to the National Economic Research Associates. This NERA study has been widely criticized due to its assumption that only the industrial sector is responsible to reduce the country's emissions by nearly 40% in 20 years. It ignores the role of all other sectors and underestimates the advances in clean energy. Many economists believe that the agreement will accelerate the development of green technologies and help create about as many jobs as it might cost in polluting industries. Today, solar jobs already vastly outnumber those in coal, making it the third largest power creation industry. With the solar industry expanding 16 times faster than the US economy overall in 2016, it is clear that more and more jobs will involve renewable technologies instead of burning fossil fuels. The third reason is that the accord only leads to a minuscule reduction in global temperature. Okay, brace yourselves, this one is bad. Trump says even if the Paris Agreement were implemented in full with total compliance from all nations, it is estimated it will only produce a 0.2 of 1 degree. He then signals with his fingers, think of that, this much, Celsius reduction in global temperature by the year 2100. Tiny amount. First off, global temperature is not falling, but rising. And the goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep that increase under 2 degrees until the end of time. Now, a temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius is the threshold of safe temperature, beyond which the increase becomes self-reinforcing. Ecosystems will collapse, species migrate and fall out of sync, and eventually a third of all life on Earth faces extinction. So how big of a help is the Paris Agreement? The expected rise in global temperature by 2100 is 0.9 degrees lower with the agreement than without. No source mentions 0.2, but it might seem close if you are Trump. To understand the significance of these numbers, I will be making a separate video explaining the ins and outs of global warming. But for now, here are some quick facts. Over the last 10,000 years, all human civilization survived within 1 degree difference from the average temperature of the Earth. But 2013 is the first year where global temperature exceeded that buffer. The 3 subsequent years after are the 3 hottest years recorded to date. The global temperature will rise to 3.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level by 2100. If a 2-degree increase will lead to a third of all life going extinct, what will a 3.8 degree increase lead to? So think of that. Is 0.9 degrees really a tiny amount? And now the last reason. Trump says that the accord is unfair to the US. He argues that China doesn't have to lower emissions until 2025, and developing countries such as India will be receiving billions and billions of dollars from the US. He adds that the US is ahead of the world in reducing emissions, and many other countries haven't spent anything and might never pay 1 dime. The billions of dollars here refer to the Green Climate Fund. It is meant to help developing countries establish renewable energy sources, and the US committed to contribute $3 billion to the fund. This is not wrong. However, a major reason that the US is more developed than countries such as India is its use of fossil fuels. Historically, the US is responsible for approximately 30% of all carbon dioxide ever emitted. This correlation of development to emission is also evident in Europe, as the EU has emitted about the same amount. Thus, it is fair for the US to contribute more to the effort of fighting climate change, as it is largely their fault. Countries such as India are still developing and thus cannot impose emission cuts as harsh as the US. China is still the biggest producer of CO2 emission, but that's because there are billions of people who live there. More people do more work and emit more CO2. This is common sense. The real indicator of a country's emission levels is per capita emission. From 1960 to 2013, the US has always had annual emissions of above 16 tons per capita, whereas China had only 1.2 in 1960 and has only peaked at 7.6 in 2013. This further shows that China had only used a small fraction of the fossil fuels burned by the US for the last 53 years. Another good example is Canada. It is not one of the major polluting countries, but it has a per capita emission of 13.5 tons. The higher standard of living means that the average Canadian uses more fossil fuels than the average Chinese. Now, you might still argue that without the Paris Agreement, the US can still fight against global warming on its own, but there are 2 major flaws to that argument. First, Trump's decision ignores the fact that climate change is a global problem. The Earth warms regardless of where the CO2 is coming from. Thus, you cannot fight global warming on your own without helping poor countries develop clean industries. Withdrawing from the agreement might lead to some short-term economic gain, thus increasing his popularity. But ultimately, it is a self-harming move to dismantle a major diplomatic success in our world. Secondly, the entire need to withdraw from the agreement is very unnecessary, as it is completely voluntary. The US can change its emission targets and financial contributions at any time, without the need to renegotiate, as Trump suggested. The success of the Paris Accord lies in this freedom. As other countries are already implementing their plans, it is very unlikely for them to all gather and renegotiate an alternative agreement. At this point, it is clear that unless Trump is as uninformed as some random YouTuber after a day of research, his intentions are not to improve the climate, but rather to gain popularity. So what should we do as the public? I think we should ignore Trump's announcements and educate ourselves on the matters such as climate change. Many major companies and government officials have already spoken out against the withdrawal and have urged the public to keep spreading this message. So if you like this video or learned anything from it, feel free to share it. Also, consider subscribing for more content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.